They say grief comes in waves. For me, it didn't. It wasn't a wave. It was a stillness. A heavy, suffocating silence that settled over my father's house the day he died, a silence that seemed to absorb every sound, every memory, every breath. My dad, Richard Miller, wasn't a man of many words. He was a man of routines, of quiet strength, of secrets held behind kind but guarded eyes. He was an engineer, a man who believed in structure and blueprints, in things you could measure and hold. And for the last 5 years of his life, as his body began to fail him in ways his brilliant mind never would, I was the one who was there. I was his structure, his routine, his steady hand. My older brother Mark was busy building a corporate empire in Chicago, and my younger sister Chloe was busy finding herself in the art communes of Northern California. I was the one left behind in dusty, familiar Cleveland, Ohio. I wasn't a high-flying executive or a free-spirited artist. I was just Alex, the middle child, the dependable one, the history teacher who managed the appointments, the medications, and the quiet, creeping dread of the inevitable. When he passed, the silence in his house became my unwelcome roommate. Every creak of the floorboards, every hum of the old refrigerator was a ghost of the life that had just ended. Cleaning out his home felt less like a chore and more like an archaeological dig through the layers of a man I thought I knew. I spent days sorting through his life's accumulation. In the garage, I found jars of screws and nails sorted by size with a meticulousness that was both maddening and heartbreaking. In his closet, his flannel shirts still held the faint, familiar scent of sawdust and Old Spice. It was a scent that transported me back to being a 7-year-old girl watching him in his workshop, convinced my father could build or fix anything in the world. Now, faced with the shambles of his absence, I felt an acute, painful irony in that childhood belief. He could fix anything but this. It was in his study, a room that always smelled of old paper pipe tobacco and something uniquely him, that I found the safe. It was an old, formidable thing, a relic from a bygone era tucked away behind a framed patent of one of his early designs for a hydraulic press component. I'd known about it my whole life, but it was just another piece of furniture as unremarkable as the filing cabinet or the globe stand. Dad used to joke that it was where he kept his grand plan. I always assumed it was just more blueprints, maybe some old stock certificates from the steel company he used to work for the deed to the house. Mundane, practical things for a mundane, practical man. His lawyer had given me the combination written on a slip of paper tucked into the will. It felt like a final piece of correspondence from a man who was never one for letters. My hand trembled as I knelt before it, the cold metal dial chilling my fingertips. The numbers felt foreign, a secret code to a life I was only just beginning to understand. Click. 27. The sound was deafening in the quiet room. Click. 9. I thought of my brother Mark, who would have approached this task with cold efficiency, probably already calculating the safe's contents as part of the estate's total value. Click. 42. I thought of Chloe, who would have seen it as a romantic mystery, a treasure chest from a pirate's tale. Me, I just felt a profound sense of trespassing. The sound of the tumblers falling into place was a thunderclap in the oppressive quiet. I pulled the heavy door open, a gust of stale metallic air hitting my face. Inside it was surprisingly sparse. There was the house deed, my parents' marriage certificate, and a small velvet bag containing my mother's wedding ring. And then I saw it. Tucked beneath a stack of old brittle war bonds was a single envelope. It was plain manila, with no markings, no name, no hint of its purpose. My heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. It felt important. The air crackled with a significance I couldn't yet name. Everything else in the safe was a relic of the past, a documented piece of history. This envelope felt like the present. It felt active. With trembling fingers, I lifted the envelope. It was heavier than it should have been. It had a certain density, a crispness that suggested something more than just a letter. I tore it open, my breath catching in my throat. Inside, there wasn't a letter. There wasn't a note. There was only a check. A cashier's check from the Cleveland Trust Company dated just 3 weeks before my father's death. The paper was crisp, the ink a stark, official black. I unfolded it, my eyes scanning for the amount. My brain struggled to process the numbers, the string of zeros that seemed to stretch into infinity. 1, comma, 0, 0, 0, comma, 0, 0, 0, $1 million. For a moment I couldn't breathe. The number just floated in front of my eyes, an impossible, absurd sequence of digits. $1 million. It was an impossible sum, a number that belonged in movies and news headlines, not in my father's dusty old safe. He was comfortable, yes, but he lived a simple, almost frugal life. He drove a 10-year-old Buick, wore the same style of corduroy pants for 30 years, and his biggest indulgence was buying premium birdseed for the finches in his backyard. Where did this come from? Why was it here? My eyes darted to the pay to the order of line, searching for an answer, a clue, a name. But the line was blank, utterly, terrifyingly blank. It was a loaded gun, a blank canvas, a question without an answer. $1 million payable to whoever held it in their hands. And right then, that was me. I sat there on the worn Persian rug of my father's study, the check clutched in my hand, the silence of the house pressing in on me. I thought of Mark with his talk of venture capital and leveraged buyouts, his expensive suits, and even more expensive divorce. I thought of Chloe with her mountain of student debt from art school and her perpetually failing pottery business. And I thought of me, the one who put her own life on hold, who traded career opportunities for caregiver duties, whose savings account was a testament to quiet sacrifice. The silence of the house was finally broken by a single chilling thought that snaked its way into my mind. This check wasn't a blessing. It was a test. And I had a horrifying premonition that it was a test my family was about to fail. I looked at the check again, the crisp paper, a stark contrast to the frayed edges of my own life. This piece of paper wasn't just money. It was a mirror, and it was about to show me the true faces of the people I loved most. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that our lives would never, ever be the same. If you've ever found yourself standing at a crossroads where family and fortune collide, then you know the fear I felt in that moment. It's a story about more than just money. It's about the secrets we keep and the price we pay for them. Before I tell you what happened when I picked up the phone to call my brother and sister, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You're not going to want to miss a single chapter of how this $1 million secret didn't just break our bank accounts, it shattered our family. Picking up the phone felt like lifting a 100-pound weight. My thumb hovered over Mark's name in my contacts list for what felt like an eternity. Mark, my older brother by 6 years, had always been the sun our family orbited. He was brilliant, charismatic, and possessed a ruthless ambition that my father had secretly admired and openly worried about. When we were kids, he was the one organizing the neighborhood baseball games, but he was also the one who'd trade you his dessert for your best baseball card, knowing full well he was getting the better deal. It wasn't just about winning. It was about the art of the transaction. He left Cleveland the day after his college graduation and never looked back, climbing the corporate ladder in Chicago with a speed that left us all breathless. His calls home were infrequent, always sounding like they were squeezed between important meetings. He'd ask how Dad was in the same tone. He'd ask about a quarterly earnings report, a data point to be logged and filed away. I knew calling him wasn't just a notification. It was an invitation for him to take control. But he had to know. He was the eldest. He was the executor of the will. It was the protocol our family had always followed, an unspoken rule that Mark was in charge. I finally pressed the call button. He answered on the second ring, his voice sharp and impatient, the ambient sound of a bustling office in the background. "Alex, I'm about to step into a meeting." "What's up?" There was no warmth, no "how are you holding up?" Just efficiency. It was the same tone he'd used with me for the past 5 years. A slight annoyance that my life tied to our father's declining health was an inconvenient analog problem in his sleek digital world. I took a deep breath, the stale air of the study feeling heavy in my lungs. "Mark, I found something." In Dad's safe. I could almost hear him mentally reshuffling his priorities, the gears of his mind clicking and whirring. "The will. The lawyer has the will, Alex. I'm the executor. We've been over this." His condescension was a familiar sting. "No, not the will," I said, my voice quiet, forcing him to lean in to pay attention. "It's something else. It's a cashier's check." The background noise on his end seemed to quiet. "For how much?" he asked, the impatience in his voice now replaced by a razor-sharp focus, the sound of a predator catching a scent on the wind. $1 million, I said, the words feeling alien on my tongue. The line went silent for a full 10 seconds. I could picture him perfectly, standing in a glass-walled office overlooking the Chicago skyline, loosening his tie, his mind working like a supercomputer, processing variables, calculating outcomes, running risk analyses. "$1 million," he finally repeated, not as a question but as a statement of fact, as if confirming the existence of a newly discovered asset. "Is it made out to the estate?" "No," I said, my stomach tightening into a knot. "That's the thing. The pay-to line. It's blank." Another pause, this one shorter, more calculated. "Don't do anything," he commanded. His tone shifted from brother to CEO. It was the voice he used to command boardrooms, the voice that brooked no argument. "Don't talk to anyone. Don't deposit it. Don't even breathe on it. I'll be on the first flight to Cleveland tomorrow morning. We'll handle this. I'll handle this." He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask about the context, about what else was in the safe, about what Dad might have intended. He just saw a problem to be managed, an asset to be allocated. The call ended, leaving me with a dial tone and a growing sense of dread. He hadn't seen it as our father's last secret, but as his first acquisition. My next call was to Chloe. My younger sister was the emotional core of our family, the polar opposite of Mark. Where Mark saw the world in spreadsheets and profit margins, Chloe saw it in colors, textures, and feelings. She'd always felt like a stranger in our practical Midwestern family, a wildflower growing in a meticulously manicured lawn. Our father loved her dearly, but he never understood her. He couldn't comprehend why she'd choose a life of uncertainty as a potter over a stable career. He'd funded her education, a source of quiet resentment for Mark, but their conversations were always strained, a mix of his practical concern and her artistic frustration. She answered the phone with a dreamy, "Hey, Lex." She was probably elbow-deep in clay, the phone pressed between her ear and shoulder. "Chloe, you sitting down?" I asked. "Ooh, mysterious." "I'm always sitting down. I'm at my wheel." "What's up?" I told her the same story. I told Mark, my voice softer, this time bracing for a different kind of explosion. When I said the words, $1 million, there was no silence. There was a gasp, followed by a nervous, disbelieving laugh. "$1 million? Are you serious, Dad? Our dad who used to reuse tea bags?" "It's real, Chloe." I'm holding it in my hand. "Oh my God," she whispered, and I could hear the rhythmic whirring of her potter's wheel stop. "Oh my God, Alex, what does this mean?" It was the right question. Not how much do I get or what's the plan, but what does this mean? She was trying to understand the why behind it, the emotional story that Mark had completely ignored. "I don't know," I confessed. "The crazy part is the check is blank. It's not made out to anyone." "Blank?" she repeated, her voice laced with wonder. That's so weird. That's not like Dad at all. He was so meticulous." We talked for another 20 minutes, our conversation weaving through shock and speculation. Chloe wondered if it was for a secret charity, or maybe for a woman he'd loved before our mom. Her mind went to the romance, the mystery. She talked about what this money could do. She could finally get her studio out of debt, maybe travel to Italy to study ancient pottery techniques. She talked about how we could use it to create a scholarship in his name for young engineers. Her ideas were hopeful, a little naive, but they were rooted in a sense of shared purpose. But as we talked, a subtle shift occurred. The initial we and us slowly started to morph into I. I could finally pay off my student loans. She'd say, her voice cracking with a vulnerability she rarely showed. I've been drowning, Alex, you have no idea. The desperation in her voice was real. I'd known she was struggling, but I hadn't understood the depth of it. The dream of a scholarship was quickly overshadowed by the crushing reality of her own financial precarity. By the end of the call, she was already spending the money in her head, just as Mark was already managing it in his. Mark's coming tomorrow, I told her. He said not to do anything until he gets here. Of course he did, she scoffed, the dreamy artist, suddenly replaced by the resentful younger sister. King Mark coming to take over his kingdom. Just don't let him bully you, Alex. We all have a say in this. It should be split 3 ways, right? That's only fair. The word fair hung in the air between us. It sounded simple enough, but I was beginning to realize that fair was going to mean something very different to each of us. I hung up the phone feeling more alone than ever. I had the check, this impossible piece of paper sitting on the coffee table in front of me. Within the space of an hour, it had transformed from a mystery into a commodity. It was no longer our father's last act. It was the catalyst for our first war. The battle lines were already being drawn, and I was standing squarely in no man's land. Mark arrived the next morning, not like a grieving son returning home, but like a CEO conducting a hostile takeover. He didn't fly commercial. He took a private jet chartered by his company, a fact he mentioned casually as he strode into the house, rolling a sleek carry-on behind him. He was dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, and he looked utterly out of place in the modest, slightly worn-out home of our childhood. The house seemed to shrink in his presence. He didn't hug me. He gave my shoulder a firm, businesslike squeeze, and his eyes immediately began scanning the room, assessing, calculating. It was the same look he'd get as a kid when he'd survey a monopoly board, identifying properties to acquire and weaknesses to exploit. "Where is it?" was the first thing he said. "No, how are you? No, this is tough. Just business." I led him to the study and pointed to the check which I had placed safely back in the envelope on our father's desk. He picked it up, his movements precise, and examined it under the desk lamp like a jeweler inspecting a rare gem. He held it up to the light, checking the watermark, his thumb running over the magnetic ink. He grunted a sound of affirmation. "It's legitimate." "Good." He placed it back on the desk and turned to me, his face a mask of corporate authority. "Okay, Alex. Here's the situation. This check being blank is legally a bearer instrument. It belongs to the person who possesses it. However, since it was found in Dad's safe, it's considered an asset of the estate. As the executor, it is my fiduciary duty to manage this asset in the most responsible way possible." His use of jargon bearer instrument, fiduciary duty, was deliberate. It was a verbal fortress, a way of establishing dominance, of turning our family home into his boardroom and making me feel like an uninformed subordinate. "What does that mean, Mark?" I asked, my voice tight. "It means we don't just cash it and split it 3 ways like a bunch of lottery winners," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "That's the most tax-inefficient, short-sighted thing we could do. This is seed capital. This is the foundation of the Miller family's next generation of wealth." He started pacing the small study, his expensive Italian shoes clicking on the hardwood floor, his energy too large and aggressive for the quiet space. "I'll set up a family trust. We'll invest the $1 million in a diversified portfolio, high-yield bonds, some tech stocks, maybe a real estate venture I've been eyeing. We let it grow. In 10 years, it could be $2 million. In 20, it could be 5. We'll be set. Our kids will be set." His vision was grand, sweeping, and had absolutely nothing to do with us. It was about him, about building a legacy that he would control. He saw the check not as a gift from our father, but as the first brick in his own dynasty. "And what about in the meantime?" I asked, thinking of Chloe's debt, of the 5 years of my life I'd just lost, of the fact that this was Dad's money, not the Miller family trust's. My voice was quiet, but there was a tremor of defiance in it. "What about Chloe? She's struggling, Mark. This could change her life right now." He waved a dismissive hand as if swatting away a fly. "Chloe needs to learn financial discipline. Giving her $350,000 would be like giving a toddler a sports car. She'd crash and burn within a year. The trust can provide her with a small annual stipend, a safety net. That's what's best for her." He said it with such paternalistic certainty, as if he knew what was best for everyone. He wasn't just our brother. He was our self-appointed financial guardian, our benevolent dictator. The worst part was I could see a twisted logic in his argument, a logic born from years of watching Chloe struggle, but the coldness of it, the utter lack of empathy, was chilling. The doorbell rang, a sharp, insistent sound that saved me from having to respond. It was Chloe. She must have driven through the night from California because she looked exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed and her clothes rumpled. But the moment she saw Mark standing there in his suit, his posture radiating control, her exhaustion was replaced by a defiant kinetic energy. She walked right past me, her gaze locked on our older brother. "Don't you dare start making plans without me, Mark," she said, her voice trembling slightly but laced with steel. "This is our father's money, not your next business deal." "Chloe, calm down," Mark said, his voice smooth and placating, the way he'd talk to a difficult client or a hysterical intern. "I'm just trying to do what's best for the family." "What's best for you, you mean?" she shot back, her voice rising. "You want to lock it all away in one of your shady investment schemes so you can play puppet master with our lives. I have a right to my share. Dad would have wanted me to have it." And just like that, the storm broke. The study, a room that had always been a sanctuary of quiet contemplation for my father, became a battlefield. They yelled, they accused, they dredged up resentments that had been simmering for decades. Mark called Chloe an irresponsible, naive child who was throwing her life away. Chloe called Mark a soulless, greedy vulture picking at the bones of their father's memory. He threw her financial struggles in her face, mocking her art as a childish hobby. She threw his messy divorce and his distance from our father back in his, accusing him of only showing up when there was money on the table. "At least I built something with my life," Mark roared. "What have you ever done but take handouts from Dad for your little projects?" "I was here," Chloe screamed back, tears streaming down her face. "When Dad was sick, I came home. Where were you, Mark? In a board meeting, closing a deal. You haven't been a son to him in 20 years. I tried to intervene, to be the peacemaker I'd always been." "Guys, stop. This isn't what Dad would have wanted," I yelled, my voice cracking, but they barely heard me. They were lost in their own rage, their own pain, their own deeply ingrained narratives of victimhood and superiority. Mark saw Chloe as a liability, a drain on the family's potential. Chloe saw Mark as an oppressor, the golden child, who always got his way and looked down on her. And me, I realized with a sickening lurch that they both saw me as a pawn, a swing vote. Mark kept looking at me for backup, expecting me to side with his logical plan. Chloe kept looking at me with pleading eyes, expecting me to defend her against the family bully. They weren't seeing their sister. They were seeing an ally to be won over. The fight raged, their voices echoing through the silent house, desecrating the grief that still hung in the air. Finally, Mark played his trump card. He walked over to the desk, picked up the envelope containing the check, and slipped it into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. "As executor, I'm securing the asset," he said, his voice cold and final. "We'll discuss this further when you're both ready to be rational adults." Chloe lunged for him, trying to grab the jacket, but he was bigger and stronger. He easily sidestepped her, his face a mixture of pity and disgust. "Don't be pathetic, Chloe." He turned and walked out of the study, out of the house, and a minute later I heard the sound of his rental car speeding away. Chloe collapsed into our father's armchair, her body racked with sobs. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, the silence rushing back in heavier and more menacing than before. The check was gone. The battle had been lost, the war had just begun, and our family was already in ruins. The days that followed Mark's departure were a special kind of hell, a cold war fought over text messages and voicemails. Chloe stayed with me at Dad's house, a ghost haunting the hallways, her grief for our father now hopelessly entangled with a burning rage towards our brother. The house itself seemed to absorb the tension. Rooms that once held warm memories of a quiet gentleman now felt like crime scenes, the air thick with unspoken accusations and the lingering energy of that terrible fight. Chloe would alternate between furious bursts of energy where she'd sit at the kitchen table, her laptop open frantically, researching probate law and the rights of beneficiaries, and long periods of despondent silence where she'd sit in the backyard staring at the bird feeder Dad had so carefully maintained. "He can't just do this, Alex," she'd say for the 10th time in an hour, her voice raw from crying and yelling. "It's not legal. It can't be. He can't just take it. It's theft." I tried to be the voice of reason, the mediator, but my words felt hollow even to me. I'd say things like, "He's just trying to protect it," or "Let's wait until things cool down." But we both knew it was a lie. This wasn't about protection, it was about control. Mark wasn't waiting for us to cool down, he was waiting for us to surrender. He communicated with us not as a brother but as a corporate entity. He wouldn't answer our direct calls. They would go straight to a crisp, professional voicemail. Instead, we'd receive curt, formal text messages, each one a small tactical maneuver in his campaign. "The asset is secure in a bank safety deposit box, awaiting probate court guidance." Or, "I am consulting with my attorney to ensure the estate is handled according to legal best practices." Every message was a power play. The use of the asset, instead of Dad's money, was dehumanizing and deliberate. The mention of his attorney was a clear threat. He was building a legal wall around the check brick by infuriating brick. He was trying to intimidate us into submission, and with Chloe it was starting to work. Her anger was slowly being eroded by a soul-crushing sense of helplessness. She didn't have the resources to fight him. She had a 20-year-old Honda Civic and a maxed-out credit card. He had a team of high-powered attorneys on retainer. It wasn't a fair fight. It was a foregone conclusion. "What are we going to do?" she asked me one night, her voice small, the fight gone out of her. "We can't afford a lawyer who can go up against his guys. We're just stuck." The breaking point, the moment the Cold War turned hot, came a week later. It arrived via a FedEx courier, a crisp, intimidating envelope addressed to both Chloe and me. The return address wasn't from Mark, but from a law firm, Dalton, Finch and Pierce. The letterhead alone looked like it cost more than my weekly salary. The paper was thick and creamy, the font severe and official. The language was dense, impenetrable legalese, but the message was chillingly clear. It formally notified us that Mark Miller, as the legally appointed executor of the estate of Richard Miller, had established an irrevocable trust for the long-term financial security and preservation of the Miller lineage. It stated that the $1 million asset had been placed into this trust. It then went on for several pages outlining the terms. Chloe and I would be considered beneficiaries, but we would have no direct access to the principal. Instead, we would be eligible to receive an annual disbursement of up to $10,000 subject to approval by the sole trustee Mark, of course, based on a formal written application and demonstration of need. A demonstration of need. I had to read that line 3 times to fully grasp its cruelty. He wanted us to beg. He wanted us to write him letters detailing our financial hardships, pleading our case, so that he, in his infinite wisdom, could decide if we were worthy of a pittance from our own inheritance. It was the ultimate power play, a way to keep us under his thumb for the rest of our lives. It was cruel, it was calculating, and it was devastatingly effective. When Chloe read the letter, something inside her broke. She didn't scream or cry. She just sat on the living room floor, the letter in her lap, and stared into space with dead eyes. The pages fluttered from her hands. "He won," she whispered, her voice completely devoid of emotion. "He's always wanted this. To be Dad. To be the one in charge of everything, doling out allowances like we're still children." I felt a rage building inside me that was completely foreign. My entire life, I had been the peacekeeper. I'd smoothed over arguments, swallowed my own feelings to keep the family balanced. I'd mediated between Mark's ambition and Chloe's sensitivity, between Dad's stoicism and everyone else's needs. But this was a step too far. This wasn't a family squabble. It was a hostile, calculated act of betrayal. He had used our father's death and his last secret to enslave us. That night, something shifted in me. The dependable, quiet Alex was gone. In her place was a daughter who felt her father's legacy was being desecrated. This $1 million wasn't just money. It was Dad's last word, his final message to us, and Mark was trying to erase it and write his own. I realized I couldn't be a spectator anymore. I had to find out why. Why would our father, a man of such precision and planning, leave behind a blank check? It didn't make sense. It was a puzzle, and I became convinced that the answer to that puzzle was the only weapon we had left. Mark thought he was playing chess, but he had missed a crucial piece on the board, our father's true intention. While Chloe slept exhausted from her grief and defeat, I went back into the study. The room felt different now, charged with purpose. I wasn't just cleaning out my father's life anymore. I was searching for the truth. I started with his desk, going through every drawer, every file folder, every nook and cranny. I read through old bank statements, tax returns, and investment reports, looking for any large transaction, any clue as to where $1 million could have come from. Nothing. It was as if the money had appeared out of thin air. Then I moved to the bookshelf. Dad was an avid reader, but his collection was almost exclusively nonfiction, engineering manuals, history books, biographies of inventors and presidents. It was as I was pulling out a heavy biography of Thomas Edison that my fingers brushed against something wedged deep in the back behind a row of encyclopedias. It was a small leather-bound journal, not much bigger than my hand. It was a type of journal I'd never seen him use. Dad wrote his notes on yellow legal pads, not in fancy leather books. My heart hammered against my chest. This felt different. This felt like the safe, a place where he kept things hidden from view. I opened it. The first page was dated 6 months before he died. The handwriting was his, but shakier than I remembered, the elegant loops of his cursive, slightly distorted by a tremor I now recognized. And the first sentence made the hair on my arms stand up. "It's time to make things right," it read. "Before I go, I have to fix the one great mistake of my life." The great mistake. I had no idea what he was talking about. To me, my father had been a man of impeccable integrity. The thought that he had a regret so profound, a mistake so large it required $1 million to fix, was a revelation that changed everything I thought I knew about him. The lawyer's letter was a declaration of war from my brother. But this journal? This felt like a map handed to me from beyond the grave. The discovery of the journal shifted the entire axis of my world. The fight with Mark, the legal threats, the suffocating tension with Chloe, it all faded into the background, replaced by an obsessive, all-consuming need to understand the man who had written these words. I sat in his worn leather armchair, the one with the permanent impression of his body, and read for hours as the moon traced its path across the sky. The house was silent around me, but the pages of the journal were screaming with a life I never knew existed. This wasn't a daily diary. It was a confession, a final accounting of a life's ledger. The entries were sporadic, written whenever the weight of his thoughts became too much to bear. He wrote about his early life, his struggles growing up during the Depression, and the immense pressure he felt to provide for his own family to give his children a stability he had never known. He wrote about my mother with a tenderness and passion that stunned me. I had only known them as a quiet content couple. I never knew the fiery love story that had preceded it, the way he described her laugh as the only blueprint he ever needed. But woven through these memories was a thread of deep, abiding regret. It all centered around one name, Blackwood Manor. At first I didn't recognize it. He wrote about it with a painful nostalgia, describing an old Victorian house with a sprawling oak tree in the front yard and a wraparound porch where his own mother used to sit. He described the smell of the wood smoke from the fireplace, the sound of rain on the tin roof, the secret hiding spot he had in the attic where he'd read adventure novels by flashlight. This wasn't our house. This was his childhood home. A place I never even knew existed in his memory, let alone as a physical location. He wrote about how his father, my grandfather, had been a proud but unlucky man, an inventor whose brilliant ideas never translated into financial success. During a particularly harsh economic downturn in the 1952nd, my grandfather had taken out a risky loan against the house to fund a new type of engine using the property as collateral. The lender was a man named Silas Blackwood, a wealthy and ruthless local businessman known for acquiring property through others' misfortune. The invention failed, my grandfather couldn't pay back the loan, and Silas Blackwood foreclosed, taking the house for a fraction of its worth. According to the journal, the loss of the home destroyed my grandfather. It wasn't just a house, it was their history, their identity, the physical manifestation of generations of Millers. He died of a heart attack less than a year later, a loss my father was convinced was brought on by the shame and heartbreak. My father, who was just a teenager at the time, made a silent promise at his father's grave one day, no matter what it took, he would buy back Blackwood Manor. He would restore his family's honor. It became the secret driving force of his entire life. Every career move, every frugal choice, every dollar saved was a step towards fulfilling that promise. His quiet, simple life wasn't just a personality trait. It was a mission. The old Buick, the worn-out pants, the reused tea bags, they weren't signs of stinginess. They were acts of devotion. He wrote about how he had quietly tracked the property his entire life. The Blackwood family had held onto it for decades, but he never gave up hope. He'd drive by it sometimes, parking down the street, just to look at the old oak tree, a silent vigil for a past he couldn't reclaim. It explained so much, the random, unexplained road trips he would take, coming home hours later looking quiet and sad. He wasn't just driving. He was visiting a shrine. Then about a year ago, everything changed. Silas Blackwood's last remaining heir, an elderly granddaughter, had passed away, and the property was finally going up for sale as part of her estate. My father saw it as his one and only chance, a final opportunity to fulfill the vow he'd made as a boy over 60 years prior. He began liquidating every hidden asset he had. He sold off the old war bonds. He cashed in a life insurance policy he'd taken out on himself decades ago. He emptied forgotten savings accounts that even I, his caregiver, never knew existed. He scraped together every last penny he had, a lifetime of quiet, disciplined saving, all for this one purpose. He managed to get $1 million together, the exact amount his real estate contacts told him the property would likely sell for at auction. The journal entry from the day he secured the money was heartbreaking. "I have it," he wrote. "It took me a lifetime, but I have it. I can finally bring Dad home." But then his health took a sharp turn for the worse. He knew he was running out of time. The auction was scheduled, but he was too weak to attend. He couldn't trust a bank transfer. He needed something immediate, something as good as cash that his representative could use. So he got the cashier's check. And he left the pay to the order of line blank because he didn't know who would win the auction. He didn't know the name of the law firm or the title company that would be handling the final sale. The blank line wasn't a mistake. It was a necessity. It was a tool designed for a single specific purpose. The final entry in the journal was written the night before he died, his handwriting barely legible. "I'm afraid I won't make it to the auction. If I don't, I hope my children will understand. I hope they'll see this isn't about money. It's about a promise. It's about family." The check is in the safe. The instructions are with the deed to our own house. I pray they find them together. The instructions. The words leaped off the page. I scrambled back to the safe, my hands shaking so badly I could barely function. I pulled out the thick folder containing the deed to our current house. My fingers fumbled with the clasp. Tucked inside, hidden between the pages of legal documents, was a single folded sheet of paper. It was a letter addressed to my children. It laid out the entire story in plain, simple terms, just as the journal had. It explained about Blackwood Manor, about the promise, about his lifelong quest. And it gave us his final wish. Use the money to buy back our history. Go to the auction and bring our family home. Let this not be an inheritance that divides you, but a legacy that unites you. At the bottom of the letter was a postscript, a final urgent command. The auction is on the 15th of October. I looked at the calendar on the wall, my blood running cold. It was the 12th of October. The auction was in 3 days. I sat there surrounded by the secrets of my father's life, the weight of his final wish pressing down on me. The $1 million was never meant for Mark's trust fund or Chloe's pottery studio or my own quiet sacrifices. It was ransom money. It was the price of redemption for a ghost. The check wasn't a mirror showing us who we were. It was a map showing us where we needed to go. And we were running out of time. I looked at the letter, then at the journal, and then I thought of Mark sitting in his Chicago office with the check in his pocket, completely oblivious to the sacred duty he was unknowingly obstructing. He thought he was executing a will, but he was on the verge of destroying a legacy. I had to get that check back, and I had to make my brother and sister understand the truth before it was too late. Armed with the journal and the letter, I felt a seismic shift in my own demeanor. The grief and confusion that had clouded my judgment for days were burned away by a white-hot clarity of purpose. This was no longer a negotiation. This was no longer a family dispute over assets. This was a rescue mission. I didn't call Mark. Calling would be a mistake. It would give him time to strategize, to build his legal walls even higher, to twist this narrative into something that served his own ends. He would dismiss the journal as the sentimental ramblings of a dying man and the letter as a non-binding suggestion. He would argue that his fiduciary duty was to the money, not to a ghost story. No, this had to be done in person. This required the undeniable physical evidence of our father's true heart. I booked a one-way flight to Chicago that left in 3 hours. I found Chloe in the kitchen staring blankly at the lawyer's letter, which was still sitting on the table like a death sentence. Her shoulders were slumped in defeat, the fight completely gone from her eyes. I placed my father's small, leather-bound journal and his final handwritten letter down on the table in front of her. "You need to read this," I said, my voice steady and firm in a way she hadn't heard before. "Everything you think you know is wrong." She looked up at me, her expression weary, as if preparing for another blow. But something in my tone, some new, unyielding certainty, made her reach for the letter. I watched as she read, her eyes flying across the pages. I saw the progression of emotions on her face, a cinematic unfolding of a soul in turmoil, first confusion, as she tried to make sense of the names and places. Then dawning comprehension, her brow furrowed, her lips slightly parted. Then a wave of profound, heart-wrenching sorrow. The tears that began to stream down her face weren't the angry, frustrated tears of the past week. They were tears of pure, unadulterated grief. They were for our father, for the secret burden he had carried his entire life, for the quiet, monumental love that had driven him to a lifetime of sacrifice. When she finished the letter, she picked up the journal, her fingers tracing the worn leather cover as if it were a holy relic. She flipped through the pages, reading passages of his shaky handwriting, her sobs now quiet, visceral shudders. "Oh my God, Alex," she whispered, looking up at me, her face a mess of tears and awe. All this time he was doing this for his own dad. For us. She touched the letter reverently as if his spirit resided in the ink. And we? We were just fighting over the money, like a bunch of spoiled children. In that moment, the animosity that had poisoned the air between us for a week vanished, replaced by a shared sense of shame and a powerful, unifying purpose. We weren't Mark's victims anymore. We were our father's children, his agents, the last line of defense for his legacy. "Mark has the check," I said, my voice low and urgent. "The auction for Blackwood Manor is in 3 days. In Pennsylvania. I'm going to Chicago. I'm getting it back. I'm coming with you," she said without a moment's hesitation, her voice now filled with the same steely resolve I felt. Her despair had been transmuted into a fierce, protective fire. "He needs to hear this from both of us. He needs to see this with his own eyes." We landed at O'Hare and took a taxi straight to the gleaming, impersonal skyscraper that housed Mark's investment firm. We didn't have an appointment. As we walked into the lobby, a cavernous space of marble and glass, we were immediately out of place. We were rumpled from our frantic travel, our faces etched with grief and urgency, intruders, in a world of calm, calculated wealth. The receptionist, a polished young woman who looked like she'd been genetically engineered for corporate efficiency, tried to stop us. "Mr. Miller is in a very important meeting. I can't possibly interrupt him." Chloe, channeling a ferocity I'd never seen in her, leaned over the massive marble desk, her eyes blazing. "You tell him that his sisters are in the lobby, and if he doesn't come out in the next 5 minutes, we're going to start talking about his father's secret $1 million check very, very loudly." It was a bluff, but a brilliant one. It was language Mark would understand, a threat of a public scene, a disruption to his carefully curated image of control. It worked. Less than 2 minutes later, Mark strode out of a set of glass doors, his face a thundercloud of fury. "What the hell are you two doing here?" he hissed, grabbing my arm and pulling us towards an empty conference room, his grip like iron. "Are you insane? This is my place of business. I have clients here." "We're here for the check, Mark," I said, pulling my arm free as he shut the door behind us. The conference room was sterile and intimidating, with a massive mahogany table and a panoramic view of the city. It was his home turf, his seat of power. I took the journal and the letter from my bag and threw them onto the table. They slid across the polished surface, coming to a stop directly in front of him. "You need to read this. Now." He looked at the items with disdain, as if they were trash cluttering his pristine table. "I'm not playing games, Alex. I have the situation under control. The trust is being finalized." "No, you don't." Chloe's voice cracked like a whip. "You don't know anything. You've been so busy playing God that you didn't even bother to ask the one important question, what did Dad want? You just assumed he wanted you to build an empire. But you're wrong. You are so, so wrong." The raw conviction in her voice, the utter lack of fear, seemed to momentarily pierce his armor of arrogance. He hesitated, then picked up the letter. As he read, I watched his corporate mask crumble. It was like watching a statue erode in fast motion. The confident CEO posture sagged, the hard lines of his face softened, and the color drained from his cheeks. He sank into one of the expensive leather chairs, the letter shaking in his hand. He then picked up the journal and flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the familiar, shaky script of our father's hand. The room was silent, the only sound the distant hum of the city 20 floors below. For the first time in my life, I saw my brother, my invincible, untouchable older brother, look small. He looked lost. The world he had constructed, a world of assets and trusts and fiduciary duties, had just been obliterated by a simple human story of a promise made by a boy at his father's grave. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. He looked up at us, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. He never said a word. All those years, all those family holidays, he never said a thing. "That was the point, Mark," I said gently, my own anger dissipating, replaced by a wave of pity for him. "He didn't want to burden us with it. He wanted to give it to us as a gift. A home. Our history. That was the legacy he wanted to leave, not some tax-sheltered investment portfolio." He looked at us, his eyes filled with a shame so profound it was painful to witness. He finally understood. He hadn't been acting as a responsible executor. He had been the villain in his own father's story. In his quest for financial security, he had become a modern version of Silas Blackwood, the man who valued money over family, the very man our father had spent his life trying to vanquish. The realization hit him like a physical blow. "The auction," he said, his mind snapping back into focus, the CEO brain kicking in but for a new purpose. "It's in 3 days." "We know," I said. "And the check is in a safety deposit box at your bank." He stood up, his movements jerky, a man trying to outrun his own shadow. "My assistant has the key. The bank closes in an hour. We have to go now." The three of us rushed out of the conference room past the bewildered receptionist, a chaotic, desperate unit. In the elevator ride down, no one spoke. We were three strangers bound by a single, desperate mission. We were no longer fighting over $1 million. We were fighting for our father's soul and for the last fleeting chance to save our own. The next 48 hours were a blur of frantic, adrenaline-fueled activity. We retrieved the check from the bank just minutes before it closed the crisp paper, feeling less like a prize and more like a sacred relic in my hands. Mark didn't even look at it. He just handed the envelope to me, a silent transfer of trust, an admission that he was no longer the sole commander of this mission. We then drove through the night, taking turns at the wheel of Mark's luxury sedan, a car that felt absurdly opulent for the solemn pilgrimage we were on. The silence in the car wasn't the tense, angry silence of before. It was a heavy, contemplative quiet. Each of us was lost in our own thoughts, re-evaluating our entire relationship with our father and with each other. I could see Mark glancing at the journal which sat on the dashboard like a compass, his face etched with a regret so deep it seemed to have aged him 10 years. He was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than his usual corporate stoicism. This was the quiet of a man grappling with the enormity of his own failure. Chloe, for her part, looked out the window, a quiet strength, having replaced her earlier despair. She was no longer the fragile artist. She was the keeper of a story, a guardian of a legacy. We weren't just siblings anymore. We were co-conspirators in our father's final secret plan. We stopped only for gas and cheap, greasy diner coffee, the caffeine fueling our race against the clock. During one stop around 3 a.m. at a desolate truck stop somewhere in Pennsylvania, Mark finally spoke. "I was so wrong," he said, staring into his coffee cup as if it held the answers to the universe. "All these years I thought Dad was, simple. I thought his frugality was a weakness, a lack of ambition. I was embarrassed by it." He looked at me, his eyes glistening under the harsh fluorescent lights. "He wasn't weak. He was the strongest man I've ever known. He was carrying this mountain on his back his entire life, and he never once complained." Chloe reached across the booth and put her hand on his. "We didn't know Mark. None of us knew. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. It was an acknowledgement of a shared blindness." We arrived in the small, sleepy town of Westbrook, Pennsylvania, the home of Blackwood Manor, the evening before the auction. The town looked like it had been preserved in amber, a relic of the past, much like the house we were there to reclaim. We checked into a modest motel, the only one in town, and spread our makeshift battle plans across a rickety table. Mark, for all his flaws, was a master strategist. His corporate ruthlessness, which had been so destructive when turned against us, was now our greatest asset. He spent hours on the phone with his real estate contacts, gathering intelligence about the auction. Who were the other potential bidders? What was the likely opening bid? Were there any developers looking to buy the land and tear the house down? His questions were sharp, his demeanor relentless. He was no longer building his own empire. He was defending our father's. He created a spreadsheet, a bidding strategy, with tiered responses and contingency plans. He was in his element, but this time he wasn't working for profit. He was working for redemption. The morning of the auction was gray and overcast the sky, mirroring the anxiety in my stomach. The auction was to be held on the front lawn of Blackwood Manor itself. As we pulled up, I saw it for the first time. It was exactly as Dad had described in his journal. A magnificent, if slightly neglected Victorian house with a wraparound porch and a grand ancient oak tree standing sentinel in the yard. It was more than a house. It was a piece of history, a silent witness to our family's greatest loss and hopefully our greatest redemption. I felt a lump form in my throat. I could almost see my grandmother on that porch, my father as a boy climbing that tree. It felt like coming home to a place I'd never been. A small crowd had gathered. There were a few local families, a historical society representative, and, to our dismay, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit who Mark immediately identified as a representative for a luxury property developer. This was our worst-case scenario. This man wouldn't see the history. He would see a prime piece of land to be subdivided. He had deep pockets and no sentimentality. The auction began. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a booming voice, started the bidding at $500, 000. Mark, acting as our designated bidder, raised his paddle. The developer immediately countered. The price climbed rapidly, 600,078. The local families and the historical society representative dropped out one by one, their faces crestfallen. Soon it was just us against the developer. The bidding reached 9,000,000. The developer didn't heaven flinch. He just kept raising his paddle with aburd arrogant air. Mark looked at me, his brows lit with sweat. Our warchest was own $1,000,000. Not a penny more. If the bidding went over, that we would lose. Our father's dream would arrive there. On this lawn. No. 9,000,000. The developer didn't even flinch. He just kept raising his paddle with aburd arrogant air. Mark looked at me. His brows lit with sweat. Our warchest was own $1,000,000. Not a penny more. If the bidding went over, that we would lose. Our father's dream would right there on this lawn. 9,250,000. Mark called out, his voice steady despite the immense pressure. 9,500,000. 9,500,000. Thedipper countered instantly, a smug smile playing on his lips. He knew how to stunt the ropes. He was enjoying this. The auctioneer's eyes darted between them. 9,500,000. Thedipper countered instantly, a smug smile playing on his lips. He knew he had us on the ropes. He's enjoying this. The auctioneer's A's darted between them. 9,950,000 going once, going twice. This was it. We had one bid left. Mark looked at Chloe and me, a silent question in his eyes. We both nodded. All in. $1,000,000. Mark said, his voice ringing out across the lawn with a finality that silenced the murmuring crowd. All eyes turned to the developer. He paused, looking at the house, then back at us. He saw three people, their faces pale with desperation, their hands clenched. The smug smile was gone, replaced by a look of cool calculation. He was weighing the profit margin, the demolition costs, the potential return on investment. To him, it was just numbers on a page. To us, it was everything. He opened his mouth to speak, and in that split second, my heart stopped. I was certain he was going to say 1,025,000. But instead, he gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head to the auctioneer and lowered his paddle. He had reached his limit. The numbers didn't work for him anymore. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. Sold for $1,000,000 to the Miller family. A collective gasp went through the three of us. We had done it. We were standing on the lawn of our ancestral home, the home that had been stolen from our family generations ago, and it was ours. Chloe burst into tears, hugging both Mark and me tightly. Mark, the stoic CEO, had tears welling in his own eyes. He looked at the house, then at the sky, and whispered, "We did it, Dad. We brought you home." We spent the rest of the day in a daze, signing papers, transferring the cashier's check, our father's entire life savings, to the estate lawyers. As the sun began to set, the lawyers handed us a single antique brass key, the key to Blackwood Manor. We walked up the creaking wooden steps of the porch, the three of us, and I fitted the key into the lock. The door swung open, revealing a dusty, silent interior filled with the ghosts of a past we were finally ready to claim. Stepping across the threshold of Blackwood Manor was like stepping into a photograph from my father's journal. The air inside was thick, with the scent of dust, old wood, and forgotten time. Sunlight streamed through the grimy windows, illuminating dancing, dust motes in long cathedral-like shafts. The house was empty, cleared out by the estate, but the ghosts of its past remained. In the grand foyer, I could see the faint outline on the faded wallpaper where a family portrait must have hung for decades. In the living room, a deep indentation in the carpet marked the spot where a grand piano, likely Saturday. Every scuff on the floorboards, every chip in the plaster told a story. We moved through the rooms, slowly, reverently, not as new owners, but as pilgrims arriving at a sacred site. It felt less like a real estate transaction and more like a spiritual reclamation. Each of us gravitated to different parts of the house, as if drawn by some invisible thread of inherited memory. Chloe was drawn to the sunroom, a beautiful glass-enclosed space overlooking what was once a sprawling garden. "Grandma loved roses," she said softly, tracing a pattern on a dusty window pane. "Dad told me once. He said she could make anything grow." She looked out at the tangled mess of weeds and thorns that the garden had become. "I think I'd like to try," she added, a hint of a new dream taking root. She wasn't just a potter anymore. She was a gardener, a nurturer, a woman ready to cultivate her own history. Mark surprisingly went straight to the library. It was a dark, wood-paneled room lined with empty shelves. He ran his hand along the carved mantel of the fireplace, a thick layer of dust coating his fingers. "Grandpa was an inventor," he said, his voice thick with an emotion I'd never heard from him before. "Dad said he used to work in here for hours, sketching his designs." He probably stood right here. For the first time, Mark wasn't talking about assets or capital. He was connecting with a history, a lineage of dreamers and builders that he was a part of. He was seeing our grandfather not as a financial failure, but as a kindred spirit. The irony that he, the ultimate capitalist, was descended from a failed dreamer was not lost on him. It humbled him. I found myself climbing the narrow, creaking staircase to the attic. Dad had described it in his journal as his childhood sanctuary, his secret hiding spot. The attic was vast and shadowy, the air even thicker up here. It was completely empty except for one small object in the far corner, a small wooden crate. It looked like it had been forgotten, left behind in the final clearing of the house. Curiosity piqued. I walked over and knelt beside it. It was nailed shut. I went back downstairs and found an old tire iron in the garage. With Mark and Chloe watching over my shoulder, their faces illuminated by the beams of our phone flashlights, I pried open the lid. The wood groaned in protest, a sound like a sigh from the past. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed newspaper from 1958, was a collection of my grandfather's things. It was a time capsule of a broken man's dreams. There were rolled-up schematics for inventions that never were, fantastical machines drawn with the meticulous hand of a dreamer. There were a few leather-bound books of poetry, and a tarnished silver locket with a faded picture of my grandmother inside. And at the very bottom there was a metal box, the kind used for storing important papers. It wasn't locked. I lifted the lid. Inside was a stack of letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. They were addressed to my father Richard from my grandfather Arthur. But they weren't letters that had been mailed. They were letters he had written but never sent, dated in the final heartbreaking months after he had lost the house. They were the words of a broken man filled with apologies, regrets, and advice for his son. "My dearest Richard," the first one began, the ink slightly blurred as if by a tear. "I have failed you. I gambled our home, our history on a dream, and I lost. Do not make my mistake. Be practical. Be cautious. Build a life of stability, not of risk. Protect what you have. Do not chase ghosts. I read the words aloud, my voice thick with emotion, the flashlight beam trembling in my hand. These letters were the source of my father's entire life philosophy. He hadn't just been frugal and cautious by nature. He had been following his own father's dying wish. He had suppressed his own dreams, his own risks to honor the words of a man consumed by failure. He had lived his life as a penance for a sin he did not commit. But the final letter tucked at the bottom of the stack was different. It was written just days before my grandfather died, his handwriting weak and spidery, a stark contrast to the confident script of the earlier letters. Richard, it read. Forget everything I said before. I was wrong. A life without risk, a life without dreams is not a life at all. I have spent these last months in a prison of my own, making a prison of regret. The house is just wood and nails. The true legacy is the courage to build something new. Don't spend your life trying to fix my mistakes. Build your own dreams. Chase your own ghosts. Live a life big enough for the both of us. Your loving father. My hands were trembling as I finished reading. My father had never seen this letter. He had lived his entire life according to the first set of instructions. The cautionary tale, never knowing his own father had given him permission, had begged him to live freely. He had spent his life chasing a ghost his father had ultimately set free. The $1 million check wasn't just about reclaiming a house. It was the ultimate act of a son's devotion to a command that had been rescinded at the 11th hour. A command he never knew was void. The tragedy of it was immense, almost too much to bear. We sat there in the dusty attic, the three of us, in stunned silence. The entire tragic, beautiful story of our family lay before us. Our father's quiet sacrifices, our grandfather's broken heart, the profound misunderstanding that had shaped all of our lives. Mark, the risk-taker, finally understood the caution in our father's eyes. Chloe, the dreamer, understood the source of his pragmatism. And I, the caretaker, understood the immense, silent weight of the promise he had carried. The money was gone. It had served its purpose. But in that dusty attic, we had found the true inheritance, the full, unvarnished, heartbreaking story of who we were. The check hadn't torn us apart. It had, in the most painful and roundabout way possible, finally brought us all home. Buying the house was the climax of the story, but it wasn't the end. In many ways, it was the beginning of the hardest part. The check was gone, spent in a single dramatic act of filial piety. What remained was a beautiful, crumbling old house that smelled of history and decay, and 3 siblings who barely knew how to speak to each other without a lawyer or a $1 million prize in the room. The euphoria of the auction, that incredible moment of shared victory on the lawn, quickly faded, replaced by the daunting, unglamorous reality of what we had done. Blackwood Manor needed everything. The roof leaked in a dozen places, the plumbing was a labyrinth of corroded pre-war pipes, and the electrical wiring was a frayed, cloth-covered fire hazard. The cost of making it habitable, let alone restoring it to its former glory, was astronomical, a number that made the $1 million purchase price seem like a mere down payment. And we were broke. Not just broke as an estate, but individually profoundly broke. The fight over the check had laid bare everyone's financial vulnerabilities. Chloe was still drowning in student loans and credit card debt from trying to keep her art afloat. Mark's high-flying lifestyle, it turned out, was largely financed by credit and risky investments that were currently underperforming. His bluster about creating a family trust was as much about shoring up his own precarious finances as it was about control. His expensive suits and chartered jets were part of a carefully constructed image, not a reflection of liquid wealth. And I had my own modest life as a teacher with a mortgage and bills and a savings account that had been significantly depleted by years of helping Dad with expenses that his pride wouldn't let him discuss with my wealthier siblings. We owned $1 million house we couldn't afford to live in, let alone fix. The irony was almost comical, a cruel punchline to our father's tragic story. For a few tense days, it felt like we were on the verge of splintering again, the unity forged in the attic already beginning to crack under the weight of practical reality. Mark, falling back into old habits, immediately started talking about selling. "We can flip it," he argued, pacing the dusty living room, his voice regaining some of its old corporate authority. "We honor Dad's wish by reclaiming it. Then we sell it to someone who can actually afford the upkeep. We can split the profit. It's the only logical move. It's financially responsible." He wasn't wrong from a purely logical standpoint. It was the sensible adult thing to do. But it felt emotionally wrong, a betrayal of the journey we had just undertaken. Chloe predictably was horrified. "Sell it, Mark. We just got it back. This is our home now. This is Grandpa Arthur's house. You don't sell your home." The old battle lines were being redrawn. Mark the pragmatist versus Chloe, the idealist, with me in the middle. But this time, something was different. This time, I didn't stay silent. The discovery of the journal, the weight of my father's true story, had changed me. I was no longer just the peacekeeper, the mediator. I was a steward of a legacy. "We're not selling it, Mark," I said, looking him straight in the eye, my voice quiet but firm. "And we're not going to let it rot, either. We're going to fix it. Together." He scoffed, the sound echoing in the cavernous, empty room. "With what money Alex wishes and good intentions don't pay for contractors. We don't have the capital. We don't have the resources." "No," I said. "But we have this." I gestured around the dilapidated room. "And we have us. We'll do it ourselves." The idea was absurd, almost laughable. None of us knew the first thing about home restoration. Mark managed investments, Chloe made pottery, and I taught teenagers about the Civil War. But in that moment, in that dusty room, the absurd idea felt like the only right one. It was a commitment not just to a building, but to the possibility of rebuilding ourselves. And so began the strangest and most transformative year of our lives. We made a pact. We would give it 1 year. 1 year of our lives, our sweat, our everything, to see if we could make a dent, to see if we could turn this wreck into a home. Mark, whose company was in a turbulent phase, agreed to work remotely, trading his Chicago skyscraper for a dusty corner of the library in Blackwood Manor. He traded his tailored suits for work boots and jeans. Chloe deferred her dream of studying in Italy and became our project manager and designer. Her artistic eye seeing the beauty beneath the decay, sketching out floor plans and color palettes on old pieces of drywall. And I, having quit my job to care for Dad and with no immediate prospects, dedicated myself full-time to the restoration, becoming the de facto foreman of our unlikely crew. We became a team, a messy, dysfunctional, but determined unit. We lived in the 2 least dilapidated bedrooms, sleeping on air mattresses and cooking on a hot plate. We learned how to plaster walls, refinish floors, and rewire light fixtures by watching endless hours of YouTube tutorials. We spent our weekends hunting for salvaged materials at antique yards, and our evenings huddled around a space heater planning the next day's work. Our conversations a mix of construction terms and slowly, tentatively personal revelations. It was brutally hard, physically and emotionally exhausting work. There were days we were so tired and covered in dust that we could barely speak. Old resentments flared up. We argued about everything: paint colors, budget, overruns, and who was working harder. Mark's innate need to control and manage would clash with Chloe's more organic, free-spirited methods. My attempts to mediate would often fail, and I would retreat into the frustrated silence that had been my lifelong coping mechanism. But slowly, painfully, something began to shift. As we stripped away the old peeling wallpaper, it felt like we were stripping away the layers of misunderstanding and anger that had defined our relationships for so long. While sanding down the original hardwood floors, revealing the beautiful scarred wood beneath, we started to talk. Really talk for the first time. In the quiet hours of the night, covered in paint and joint compound, the walls of our defenses came down. Mark admitted the immense pressure he'd always felt. As the eldest, the crushing expectation to be more successful and financially savvy than our grandfather. He confessed that his aggressive attempt to control the money was born out of a deep-seated fear of repeating that failure, a fear that had driven him to become a man his father probably wouldn't have recognized. Chloe, in turn, talked about how she'd always felt like an outsider, how Dad's inability to understand her art felt like a rejection of her very soul. She admitted that her desire for the money wasn't just about debt. It was about seeking validation, about proving to them and to herself that her path had value. And I, for the first time, spoke about the profound loneliness of being the caretaker, the quiet resentment of being the dependable one, whose own life was put on pause, and the heavy, unspoken burden of being the family's emotional shock absorber. With every wall we rebuilt, we were rebuilding the broken bridges between us. We weren't just restoring a house. We were restoring our family nail by painful nail board, by painstaking board. There was no single moment of dramatic forgiveness. It was a slow, gradual process built on shared labor, forced proximity, and the humbling experience of realizing none of us had all the answers. The house, our father's legacy, forced us to see each other, not as caricatures, the shark, the flake, the saint, but as flawed, complicated human beings, all just trying to make sense of the family we were born into. It was the hardest work any of us had ever done. It's been 2 years now since we first stepped foot in Blackwood Manor. The house isn't finished. It may never be. The west wing still needs a new roof, and the garden is a chaotic, beautiful work in progress. But it's no longer a crumbling relic. It's a home. It's filled with the scent of fresh paint and sawdust, with mismatched furniture we found at flea markets and painstakingly restored, and with the sounds of life, Chloe's music drifting from the sunroom, the buzz of Mark's sander from the workshop he built in the old carriage house, the click of my keyboard from the library. We live here, all 3 of us. It's an arrangement none of us could have ever predicted, a strange and unlikely outcome born from crisis. The 1-year pact came and went, and no one ever mentioned leaving. Mark's company did end up downsizing, and in the corporate reshuffle, he lost his high-powered job in Chicago. The old Mark would have been devastated, his identity shattered. But the man who had spent a year rebuilding his ancestral home was different. He discovered in a twist of fate he never saw coming that he had our grandfather's hands and our father's meticulousness. He was a brilliant carpenter. He now runs a small local business out of the carriage house, specializing in the restoration of historic homes. He's less wealthy by a factor of 10, but I've never seen him so content. He found more satisfaction in restoring a piece of forgotten history and the tangible result of his own labor than he ever did in a corporate merger. He's building a new kind of legacy, one measured in quality and craftsmanship, not just profit margins. Chloe has set up her pottery studio in the glass-walled sunroom. The light is perfect, she says. She didn't have to go to Italy to find her inspiration. She found it here in the textures and colors of our own family's past. Her new collection is inspired by the patterns on the antique tiles we found in the fireplace and the colors of the Pennsylvania landscape outside her window. She sells her work online and at local craft fairs, and for the first time her business is not just surviving, it's thriving. She's not just the family's dreamer anymore. She's an entrepreneur, a creator, a success in her own right. She found her validation not in a check but in her own hands, in the same house where her grandmother once tended to roses. And me, I found my calling not in caretaking but in storytelling. After the first year, I started a blog and then a small YouTube channel documenting the restoration of the house and the incredible history we had uncovered within its walls. I realized our story about family secrets and the true meaning of inheritance resonated with people. That channel has become my job, my passion. It allows me to stay here in this house and be its guardian, its historian, sharing the lessons we learned in the dust and debris. I am still a teacher, but now my classroom is global, and my subject is the history that truly matters, the history of a family finding its way back to itself. Our relationships aren't perfect. We are not a sitcom family who solved all their problems in a 30-minute episode. We still argue. Mark is still bossy, Chloe is still messy, and I still have the tendency to retreat into silence when things get tense. The wounds we inflicted on each other during that first terrible week after finding the check haven't vanished completely. They've become scars, reminders of how close we came to destroying everything. But the anger is gone, replaced by a hard-won, fragile respect. We have learned to talk, and more importantly, we have learned to listen. We are not the family we were, nor are we the idealized family we might have wished to be. We are something new, something more honest, something forged in plaster dust and shared purpose. Sometimes on quiet evenings, I'll sit on the wraparound porch, in the very spot where my grandmother once sat, and look at the massive oak tree in the yard. I think about that $1 million check. It feels like a lifetime ago. The money was a catalyst, a bomb that detonated in the center of our lives and blew apart the facade we had all been hiding behind. It tore us apart, yes, but in doing so, it forced us to confront the wreckage and decide what was worth rebuilding. It led us down a path of pain, betrayal, and discovery, and ultimately, it led us back to each other and back to this place. My father's last wish was to unite us with a legacy. He couldn't have known how chaotic and painful that unification would be. He couldn't have known that the true legacy wasn't the house itself, but the difficult, messy, and beautiful process of putting it and ourselves back together. The check is gone, but we are richer than we have ever been. We found our history in a dusty attic, we found our purpose in the act of rebuilding, and we found each other in the ruins. The story of the Miller family is not a fairy tale with a neat, happy ending. It's an unfinished chapter in a very old book, and for the first time in our lives, we are finally writing it together. And that I've come to realize is an inheritance worth more than any amount of money.